My name is Sandy Starr. I'm Communications Officer at the Progress Educational Trust, and that's a registered charity that works in the fields of genetics and assisted conception and embryo stem cell research and related areas. This Battle of Ideas session, this breakfast banter, is entitled Life Off Earth, Are the Aliens Out There? And we are looking at extraterrestrial life, and specifically intelligent extraterrestrial life. The session is sort of an overture to a strand which is called The Battle for Our Brains, and it's sponsored by the Wellcome Trust, whose support we're very grateful for. And the idea of this strand, The Battle for Our Brains, is to examine some of the big questions about what it means to be human, and what categories such as brain and mind and even soul mean. And I think it's actually very fitting that we're going to begin that investigation today off-world, as it were. We're going to think about what it means to be non-human, what it means to be extraterrestrial, or even if there's a sense in which intelligent extraterrestrials may, by virtue of their intelligence, already be human, despite the fact they originate elsewhere. And we're very fortunate this morning to have with us to discuss these issues three very distinguished and contrasting speakers, whom I'll introduce to you in the order in which they're going to speak. I've only got time to say quite a little bit about each of them, so if you're not familiar with them, I really do recommend you look up their much more extensive biographies on the Battle of Ideas website. On my far right, we have Dr. John Elliott, and he's head of SETI Research UK, and that's the UK division of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And the focus of John's work there is how to detect and decipher messages from other worlds. If they try to get in touch with us, chances are John will be the person who hears about it and tells the rest of us. He's also a reader in intelligence engineering at Leeds Metropolitan University, which is very fitting for the Battle for Our Brains strand. But if you don't mind, John, I think when you give your talk in a moment, you may have to explain for the benefit of some of us precisely what intelligence engineering is. Next, on my immediate right, we have Mark Vernon. Mark is a philosopher. He was previously an Anglican priest, and he's the author of numerous books, most recently How to Be an Agnostic. And when that book was originally published, it was called After Atheism, Science, Religion and the Meaning of Life. And with apologies to you, Mark, I have to confess, I actually preferred the original title. Certainly, science, religion and the meaning of life are the things we hope to grapple in this session. Last, but by no means least, on my left, we have Richard Swan, to whom we're especially indebted because it was Richard who originally came up with the idea for this session and who put it together. Richard was previously an English teacher and vice principal at Harvey Grammar School in Folkestone. He's an author of various things, study guides, fiction, poetry, and he and I have crossed swords on the topic of this debate earlier this month in the pages of In Debate magazine. We had a little head-to-head, this is us having a head-to-head, on the question, would aliens prove that humans are nothing special? And Richard said, yes, it would prove that, and I said, no, it wouldn't. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that today. They're going to kick us off. They're going to speak for no more than 5 minutes each. I will keep them to time. Clarify quickly before we begin. There are lots of exciting reasons to be having this discussion today. There's been the discovery of hundreds of exoplanets, planets orbiting around stars other than our own in recent years. A couple of years ago, NASA launched the Kepler mission, which is searching for Earth-like exoplanets where there might be life. Some of our discussion will be about the likelihood of extraterrestrial life, and John is particularly qualified to cover that. But I would like it if the main focus on the discussion in the brief time we've got is not the likelihood, but the ramifications. You know, if we do find intelligent extraterrestrial life, what does it mean? Without further ado, John, can you kick us off?
I'll try. Intelligence engineering, okay. It's modelling, understanding what are complex systems that emanate from an intelligence. So, all right, humans tend to be the template here. So, what is an intelligent system? How does it work? So we go from the mind how the brain works, the structure of that, through to the systems it creates, like language, behaviour, reasoning, thinking, all these to be modelled, understood, for both detection in the sense of what we're talking about now, especially in communication, because for us to communicate, to learn, to reason are the cornerstones of what we would call intelligence. So at a distance, to understand what communication, what structure that forms, and to be able to detect it is certainly central to any SETI work. So that's a sort of rough guide to what I do, and it's holistic research as best it can be, because all these areas relate, and to not attempt to understand one facet of it really puts you into an area that you're increasing your ignorance, and it's not a good path to follow. So all these things are interconnected, and the way that the sessions pan out today will illustrate that, I'm sure. So hopefully I've given you a flavour of what that is. Right, search for life. I go back to probably the first principles. We've been looking out into the night sky ever since we've been human. Our curiosity almost demands what's beyond the next rock. In this case, the next rock's the next planet. And you don't have to go out the solar system to actually realise that those other worlds, those other moons going round those other planets are abundant with the building blocks for life. They have hydrocarbon lakes, methane, water, all the constituent elements we have, they have, and sometimes more in spades. We are in the Goldilocks zone, so-called, for our particular type of life forms, but that doesn't mean that other life forms can exist out there. In fact, it's highly likely. Now, I'm not talking intelligent life at the moment, I'm just talking about life, whether it's microbial or minor complex sort of systems. And nevertheless, smart money is that exists out there, because even now with the recent new star forming, they're able to detect that water is already part of that initial system in the star formation, and water is one of the baselines for life as we know it. So it's everywhere, and if you even think about the whole likelihood, and much of what we do, everything we do, when your decision making is based on probabilities. With at a conservative estimate of 10,000 billion stars in the universe, and probably we have planets around most of them, and there'll be multiple planets, so we can, at least I would have thought, say one-to-one correspondence is not far beyond what it's going to be. So we're going to something like 10 to the power of 21 planets at least, with the possibility of holding life. It would be an awful waste of space, as Carl Sagan said, not to have any other life out there. And probably an incredible arrogance that it isn't. So they're the sort of reasonings we go through, and there's a Drake equation that estimates conservative. Unfortunately, it has the parameters pretty much nailed, but plugging the numbers in is a new thing. So the likelihood of intelligent life in our own galaxy was originally thought to be about 10,000 civilizations, different planets out there. Now we're beginning to plug the numbers in because our technology is now allowed us to. So as you were saying, we found over 700 exoplanets now. And some of the more recent ones are more Earth-like because our sensitivity detect is increasing. We are right at the beginning, we've just come in through the radio age. Anything out there that's actually transmitting is bound to be more intelligent than we are, I would have thought, to be quite honest. So it's certainly more advanced in technology. Now, communication is an invaluable tool for transferring information from one place to another, whether it's in time and space. And if there's any intelligence out there, they'll be communicating. And that's where my research focuses on mainly, because the mind behind it, the information that you have to actually convey, the building blocks of describing the world around you to actually communicate. There are principles behind that, the way all humans communicate. Forget the veneer on top. Go into the area where you're not thinking about the sounds and the symbols you make, but the chunks of information you have to convey to get the message across. That's where I am, in a very small nutshell, and there are universals there that I can detect in a signal from outer space and begin to decipher it up to the level of what the meaning is. There you go.
Mark, your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Personally, I think the question of whether there's life out there is just completely open, and by which I mean we have really no idea what we're asking. John there mentioned 10 to the 21 planets and so on. Well, unfortunately, scale is no guarantee. If you could have an infinite set of even numbers, and it's an even number that goes on forever, and you'll never ever find an odd number. So scale, I don't think necessarily helps. Similarly, science, as I understand anyway, has absolutely no idea about the origins of life. Sort of various assumptions are smuggled in, like you talked about building blocks as if the origins of life is some sort of mechanical inevitability, but that's a pure guess. We have a lot of idea about the origin of species, but not the origin of life. Charles Darwin's a very smart guy. The other thing is, I guess, is local, what you might call local anthropic concerns, and this is what it takes just on this planet, as it were, to support life. And the Gaia work that's been done is very fascinating here, I think, for that reason, that the more you look, the more intricate the sets of connections have to be, if you like, and that may make life very, very, very unlikely. I don't know, but just to, so often in these kind of conversations, the speculation is so much fun that you kind of forget that perhaps the basis of the speculation is completely unfounded, and that just may be the case. That said, that's sort of my scepticism. Sandy asked me particularly to talk about the religious ramifications should aliens, we make contact or whatever, and so let me just offer a few thoughts on that. And basically, I think that actually world religions have an awful lot of resources which will serve them very well should ET be in touch. And this is both the longevity of the time that religious thinkers have thought about the question, which is quite surprising, I think, and also philosophically, the philosophical underpinnings of certainly Western religions, but also I think Indian religions have comparable resources to draw on too. So let me just say a couple of things very quickly about those two things. First of all, the history. Theologians and spiritual writers and so on have thought for many centuries, right since the ancient Greeks actually, about what it might mean to find aliens. And the reason is because many of them were interested in infinity. And if you're interested in infinity, then why should the cosmos be limited? And if the cosmos isn't limited, then it seems pretty likely that there might be aliens elsewhere, notwithstanding the problem of scale. And particularly in the Christian context, many theologians and writers have speculated that one planet seems a rather sort of paltry activity, limitation for an infinite God who is overflowing with goodness and love and so on. And let me just read a very, very short section from this poet I rather like, Thomas Traherne, a 17th century poet writing at the beginning of the scientific revolution. And he wrote a very nice treatise called The Celestial Stranger, in which he imagines an alien coming to Earth. This is in the 17th century. And he says, this little star, by which he means our planet, so wide and so full of mysteries, so capacious and so full of territories, containing innumerable repositories of delight when we draw near, who would have expected, who could have hoped for such enjoyments? Thus would a celestial stranger be entertained in the world, and to this voice we ought to echo, blessed is the man to whom thou choosest and causest to approach unto thee. So it's a kind of celebration for him. Alien life would be a celebration of the extraordinariness of creation. Another resource, I think, is the philosophical resource. And there's a very nice thought experiment that the cosmologist George Ellis laid out, which helps with this. He asked us to imagine how we might communicate with aliens. I'm sure it's very familiar to you. Should they arise. And it seems very natural to think that we would be able to communicate via mathematics. Pi is in the sky. Pi will presumably be the same wherever you are in the universe. That's a very fundamental assumption in modern physics, in fact. You might be able to expect to communicate by music. And when Voyager went out, it famously, at Carl Sagan's prompting, had the Voyager Golden Record put on it, which has music of Beethoven and so on. So there seems sort of music might make some sense. But George Ellis pushes it a step further and says, could we communicate by talking about ethics? Could we communicate by talking about, say, beauty or love or what's good? And his suggestions, maybe we could. He argues that ethical systems have arisen fairly independently across the surface of the Earth, and yet there are quite common themes. And he argues that this isn't sort of just a question of evolutionary forces, that people have to live together, as it were, so they arise at things like the Golden Rule. Sometimes that's talked about in evolutionary ethics, because ethics is much, much more than that. And, for example, a very common theme in ethics is so-called kenotic ideas, that to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. Socrates talked about it, Jesus talked about it, Lao Tzu in China talks about it, maybe finding yourself to lose yourself. Maybe aliens discuss such things too. So this is the idea that a sort of moral consciousness, if you like, is written into the fabric of the universe, much like mathematics seems to be written into the fabric of the universe too. And it's a broadly Platonic idea, as said in the West, and both Islam, Judaism and Christianity draw enormously from Platonism. And so I think we'd have tremendous resources which to confront the extraordinary experience that it certainly would be should these aliens appear, though I don't think we should get too excited about them calling immediately, I must say.
Thank you, Mark. We'll try not to get too excited. Actually, let's get excited. Richard.
A couple of miles from here, you can examine the most remarkable object that I think any of us are likely to see in our lifetimes. It is an alien artifact created by a species with larger brains than ours and certainly comparable technological skills. It is, of course, a Neanderthal axe head in the British Museum. And one looks at it, I must say, with wonder and awe. I also look at it with a sort of sense of loss, really. The Neanderthals were around for about 300,000 years. And if they just made it through another 25,000 years into historical times, then I think our whole vision of humanity, what it means to be human, our whole cultural, philosophical, theological systems would have been different. Had they made it the full 30,000 years, then I think probably today there would have been a few Neanderthals sitting here in the audience, and they'd have had a few words to say about our species' sense of uniqueness and specialness and greatness. I'm going to refrain from the obvious joke about, looking out and saying, well, I think actually a few of them did make it in. But if you pop outside in the interval...
I see what you did there.
Thank you. If you pop outside in the interval and look at the smokers, I think you'll get the general idea. Anyway, my point is, of course, is that we know already how humanity will deal with the discovery of alien life. And it's quite interesting and revealing, and I think rather sad, because the answer in many ways is that we're probably just going to ignore the problem. We, on the whole, tend to ignore most of the evidence of hominid evolution. We tend to ignore most of the evidence about Neanderthals. Sandy, I suspect, will be probably denying that Neanderthals even exist as a separate species. So what we tend to do is we cling to that anthropocentric view, which says that our species is basically it. It is the species in the galaxy. I don't really hope it's going to be much better if we discover extraterrestrial life. And I'd just like to make this simple point here, partially building on what John and Mark were saying. The reason, from the sense for suggesting this session, is that we are going to know very soon whether there is life out there or not. As John says, the technology is now advancing so fast, our sensitivities are advancing so fast in our equipment, that we will be able to detect biological signatures on planets around nearby stars within the next few years. So if there is life out there of some form, we will detect the evidence of it. If we don't detect any life within sort of measurable space, then we probably can be rather sure that we are actually alone, and then we're going to have to go back and deal with that that issue. But I think in the next few years we will know one way or the other at last, after 5,000 years of wondering, we're actually going to be clear whether we're alone or not. And that's important. But if we just discover sort of life of some form, then I think scientists obviously are going to get very excited, because they're going to have all sorts of interesting questions about the evolution of life, whether life forms evolve in the same way in various places, and so on and so forth. But a lot of people, I think, will just say, well, we always thought there was life out there, hey, and get on with their lives as usual. Even the discovery of intelligent life, I think it will depend. If that intelligent life is either lesser than our own or just equivalent with our own, particularly if it's slightly lesser, then it won't cause any difficulties at all for most people. They'll assimilate that information quite readily. When it gets exciting, I think, is if we find evidence of intelligence demonstrably superior to our own. If we get, and that, I think, given our tendencies, means technologically superior, because to us that would mean threat. And I think at that point people would tend to start exercising their mind, and it's at that point, I think, that the question arises of how genuinely would we respond. Would we merely want to wipe them out? Would we, as Sandy would like to do, call them honorary human status? Or would we just want to see whether they had oil? Thank you.
Can we have a round of applause for our speakers? There are many things I want to ask them. The word anthropocentric used in a pejorative way is a good way to get my knee jerking in the morning. This is a very short session, so I'm going to give you first dibs. So I'll take questions in batches, then come back to the panel. Right, can I begin down here, please?
All the mobile life forms on Earth, even those with compound eyes, have two of them. But the Olympic mascots rather upset me because there only seemed to be one. Could there be a mobile Earth life form that exists without a means of locating another life form anywhere in the EM spectrum with only one eye?
That's a very interesting question from a variety of perspectives.
I just wondered if we could learn anything about the development, about life on Earth and the development of life, how it worked here. And from what I know, Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. First bit was very, very hot. And then life formed pretty much straight away. It's very, very old life on Earth. So it seems to me that just life, reproductive, some organic material that can reproduce itself, that's not that unlikely. It just keeps happening all the time. But the key bit is intelligent life, which kind of, even after 4 billion years, it only just appeared. That's us. And I think, well, the key bit for that is you have to think about intelligent life and what that means. I'd say we're the only intelligent species, proper intelligence. And intelligence isn't, I don't think you can have them being more intelligent than us, because I don't see intelligence as something that you've got a certain amount of. You get a fixed amount and you use it up. It's particularly lay interpretation of intelligence to kind of equate that with IQ, where you get this fixed amount, you don't get any more, and don't use it up all at once. Whereas I see intelligence as more open-ended. It can develop. It's more akin to what you know and understand, and we develop that culturally because we learn things from each other.
Two questions. One is, and it relates to the last point, which I thought was very good. How helpful is it to speculate about other life forms and what it would mean for us? In the sense that they could be a threat, they might not be a threat. They could be more technologically advanced than us and see us in a rather sympathetic light, or they might want our oil. They could be looking for resources themselves. It's, it seems very difficult to guess what the implications would be. So how fruitful is it to speculate what our relationship could be to some unspecified life form? And the other question is, which I think is, for me, more interesting, is to understand where we are at in terms of understanding the possibility of life on other planets. Just the more, perhaps the more mundane specifics of how things have moved forward and what we now understand.
Okay, if you could pass the microphone back to Ken MacLeod, who is a renowned science fiction author, among other things. Please.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel what they think about what their speculation is in relation to the so-called Fermi paradox, which is the most obvious objection that I've ever heard to the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligent life. It's quite simple. It's that the overwhelming probability would be that any extraterrestrial intelligent life would be older than ours, just by the odds. And they would have had plenty of time to spread through the galaxy. The sky would be full of their, if not their ships, at least their radio waves. We haven't detected anything. What Fermi said was, if they're there, why aren't they here?
I see the other hands, but I'm going to come back very briefly to the panel before going out again. We have the Fermi paradox. We have scale being no guarantee. That's Mark's riposte to you, John. We have Richard suggesting that maybe the intelligent other species is behind us rather than before us. Respond to whatever you find most interesting and relevant to your concerns. Beginning with you, John.
I won't go for the one I think, because there are loads of different strategies out there, from 0 to a few, like the spider. Life here is the template I use, and it's the one you've got to start with, because you've got to start somewhere. So by looking at over 60 different languages, realising the structural universals as a template for communication, also looking at dolphins. Dolphins have a signature of communication complexity that actually, in a very short summary, ends up 5/9 of our own. It's another lecture, that is. But the encephalization quotient, which is body mass to brain size, is 5/9 of our own. What happens is, in your communication, the limitations of your cognition are actually in evidence. Your brain can only juggle so many things. Your cognition is that. That's your brain complexity, your limit of your intelligence in some manner of form. And you can actually see that in communication, which is really useful. So there's those things, looking at those aspects of measuring intelligence. So if an ET sends me an intergalactic email, by pure measuring factors, if I'm right, I'll be able to tell you how intelligent they are. So there's a start there. Conjecture about what will they be like can be dangerous. I won't mention one thing here. Sending messages out from this planet saying, hi, here we are, is like prodding a hornet's nest to SETI, and they are very, very conservative overall, because they have to be. And the debate goes on that we have, and primarily me involved, strategies for messaging and how to do it and how to say hi. Unfortunately, they don't want us to, because they just might be ugly out there. So that is a debate that actually ties your hands.
Right, thank you, John. Mark.
Yeah, well, just a couple of thoughts to throw out that maybe have some resonance with what's been said. Well, I must just say that the whole intelligence question is very interesting to me too, because we basically have no idea how intelligence works. People say it's to do with brain size. Well, brains are necessary, but that's obviously not sufficient. Google is stupid because it's modelled on some kind of computer idea of what intelligence is. So we're clearly, to my mind, doing something else, and it's still very unclear what we are doing. So just to throw more scepticism out there. But I wanted to make a broad point, actually, which kind of addresses the one I point a bit, which is that I think I'm very influenced in my thought on this by a book by Simon Conway Morris, the evolutionary paleobiologist at Cambridge. And he wrote this book called Life's Solution. And he, along with Richard Dawkins actually, believes that that evolution exhibits convergence, that it's come up with the same solutions to natural problems many times, and binocular eyes, saber-toothed tigers, the molecular biology in cells. There's all sorts of examples of this, hundreds of them. And so Simon Conway Morris concludes that it seems pretty likely that if we did discover aliens, they would be sort of recognisably like us, in that they might have eyes, they probably have digits, opposable thumbs, things like this. So I think that, and they wouldn't have compound eyes. Physically, that's impossible. They'd have to have compound eyes like the size of, sort of half the size of a football pitch in order to get the resolution to actually, step off the planet. So they'd have binocular eyes like ours. But convergence, I think, is it's a very controversial area in evolution. Stephen Jay Gould famously opposed it enormously. But convergence lends support to the idea that if there are aliens, given all the provisos, that they perhaps would look, they'd be recognisably like us.
They may be among us now. Richard, your thoughts? I'm conscious no one's really got to grips with the Fermi paradox either, so feel free to...
Can I race them very, very fast?
Go on.
Binocular vision is simply the most efficient. 2 eyes are better than 1 because it gives you depth perception. More than 2 gets wasteful on resources. So binocular vision, good news really. The superiority of intelligence, I think that's sort of kind of already mentioned. There are variations in intelligence. Dolphins are perhaps less intelligent than we are, perhaps more. depending on how you look at it. There are variations, and what's out there we don't know. Tony's points, how helpful is it to speculate? Well, I always think that, you know, if the French were invading England, would you want to wait till they'd landed on the beach to decide what to do about that, or would you like to kind of think about that in advance and perhaps prepare the way? The post-detection group, of which John's a part, is saying, well, let's think about this issue in advance. You know, if they land on the White House lawn, it's perhaps a bit late to start thinking about what we might do. Let's think about it in advance, and I think that's a sensible precaution, really. Where are we at, Tony? The answer is, again, John's much more qualified than I am to say, but we are now able to detect a whole range of things that we weren't able to detect a few years ago. We now, for instance, started discovering the weather around other planets, and we can read a lot into atmospheres and so on. So again, we can detect things we couldn't detect before. And finally, the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox, interestingly, the point about the Fermi paradox, of course, it was created, rather like the Drake equation, in the days when the space race was really beginning, and there was that sort of vision that we would just continue the space race, you know, at an increasing pace, that by now we'd have colonies on the moon, perhaps on Mars, and we would be zooming out into the galaxy very, very fast. Now, of course, we know that that's not automatically true. It's not automatically true that a civilization has to go space hunting. There are lots of good reasons not to do it. And the assumption that any race is going to expand into the galaxy is a rather old-fashioned one, interestingly. It's not automatically true. And so, although the Fermi paradox is still a fascinating one, it's not automatically a barrier.
Okay, very brief point from Mark.
Well, just a thought occurred to me on the Fermi paradox. I think it was from Freeman Dyson, who's very entertaining on these issues, and he remarked that the Fermi paradox makes the assumption that, which is a bit like what was just said, that, you know, aliens would move into space much as we imagine ourselves doing so. But he speculates that it'd be much, much more sensible to fire very, very tiny dust particles into space in order to travel the interstellar distances. So aliens may well be amongst us already, but just as, you know, dust particles we just don't even, or some other way we don't even think to look. Which is a slightly spooky thought.
Or I'm going to abuse my chair's prerogative to think the other direction is scaling up. I mean, it's only because we exist at the scale we do that we think of binocular vision, that we don't actually think about the advantages of perceiving the curvature of space-time, which is only apparent at much, much larger scales. You could imagine an organism that had some means of perceiving that readily. But then again, one could argue that because humans have conceptual means of understanding the curvature of space-time, we effectively can perceive it anyway. One way we've transcended our evolutionary circumstances is by having forms of conception that augment or supplant our perception. I'll throw that out there.
Does the panel think that how we treat and view intelligent life on Earth, like octopus and elephants, has relevance to both how we'll treat aliens and what alien life might be like? I know dolphins have been mentioned. I mentioned this with relevance to octopus. What you may not know about octopus is that aquarium owners and managers are aware that they can actually lift the lids off tanks, cross the floor out of water, pop into a nearby fish tank, go fishing, cross the floor back and get into their tank. So you have to put special locks on the top. Now, what's notable is we actually eat these things. Since I found this out, I would never touch octopus.
I'd like to assume you're going to have a bit more sort of evidence of proof of intelligence. Let's just assume we've discovered some, whether it looks like an octopus or an elephant or a dolphin. I don't think any of those animals are intelligent, really. They might have, they're just not as good at it as people and don't build stuff. And I would imagine that if we're really serious about saying we have discovered some life on Earth, off Earth, then it might well be not just analysing linguistic transmissions, that we might be seeing some terraforming or whatever it is. So let's just assume we do have some pretty good evidence that there is intelligent life. We may not know what it looks like or how it's arrived at. You seem very, very split on the panel between how optimistic we should be about how we would treat those. And I just wanted to look into that in a little bit more detail. Say all the world religions can sort of imagine, you know, people from the stars or whatever, and I'll accept that. Why should we look at our history and say, well, something so different, we've never had aliens before. It's a very difficult thing to sort of How do you actually conceive that, and why are you so pessimistic on the other end?
In a sense, this is picking up both those points, because historically, and to come back to some of the 17th and 18th century examples, what we're actually really good at is defining other people as not intelligent. We did it to blacks. The poet Phyllis Wheatley, 50 years spent claiming she, and I regard this as rather appropriate, parroted language. And of course, parrots are the latest to come up as possible linguists. Yes, there's some excitement about things being as intelligent as us, but not only do we often define intelligence as having to look like ours, but when we don't want to acknowledge it, we find ethical reasons not to, and that, to me, is the ethical question. How do we get beyond that instinct to essentially decide other people aren't intelligent?
If we do discover sentient life, do we observe the prime directive? And if we find something prior to sentient life, I mean, do we sort of start leaving sort of mysterious black obelisks for them to develop, or do we actually intervene maybe to make them more intelligent?
I think it's quite interesting, the sort of discussion of aliens and intelligent life, because it does make you reflect on what constitutes intelligence. A thought experiment that has often occurred to me is, if intelligence is what intelligence does, you could conceive of an intelligence that would constitute, for instance, something like a particularly smart bunch of ants, where each individual doesn't have that much intelligence, but which collectively could act in an intelligent way. And I've got the name of the computer scientist who specified how do you know whether something's intelligent? Well, if you can't see them and you can communicate with them and they fool you into thinking that they're intelligent, then they probably are. I think there are other models for intelligence which wouldn't necessarily be humanoid.
I was just wondering, everyone on the panel and in the audience has been using the word life, but no one's actually defined it yet. And since there are many different definitions of life, which one are we using here? Are we using something that has Earth-like biochemistry type of system, or a looser definition of life?
Just briefly on the intelligence question, to try and turn it around a little bit, I think from what struck me from reading the reaction to Richard's excellent article in The Independent the other day is that we seem to have problems seeing ourselves as intelligent or special, or so all kinds of reactions like, why would aliens want to have anything to do with us? We're destructive. They'd be more interested in the animals than with us. Made me think of the old Star Trek film where aliens or an alien probe came from across space to talk to whales, and that might be an extreme example, but it is fairly typical, I think.
Yeah. Star Trek 4, it was all downhill from there. The question about definition of life is very interesting. Mark, you mentioned Gaia theory. Gaia theory has a very sneaky definition of life that sort of relativizes it, where you can say that a planet is living relative to one that isn't. Then you can scale up or down from that, and it can be kind of sneaky. But anyway, you may disagree. So if you could conclude your closing thought, keep it brief, reflect on whatever you like that's been said, and in the same order as we began. So John.
Right, well, life question, I won't go into what you call the definition of biological life in a sense, but we will be looking for not just what you would traditionally think as life, an intelligent life, trying to communicate, or the evidence of it being there, but also non-biological, the obelisk you're talking about, this sort of thing, where it may be even just a legacy from a previous intelligence that no longer exists, or is not in a part of the universe that could ever actually meaningfully contact us or see evidence of. So the remit sort of is shifted in that sense. Post-detection is another area published in using the research and communication, all these structures we've been talking about, is a rationale for how do we deal with identifying there is something else out there, whether they're signalless or whether there's evidence of technology. SETI has a protocol initially for just saying it's there, we have tenure within 24 hours that we know. From that, the strategy hadn't been in place until now, beginning on the science-based evidence, being able to begin to realise what we need to do to disseminate that information in a timely manner without people causing panic and disruption where it needs not to be.
Okay, thank you, John. And Mark, your brief closing thoughts.
Yeah, well, just to offer a few more comments which kind of hope touch some of the questions. I know it's frustrating to ask a question if it hasn't been addressed, but that's the nature of the game. But anyway, I think that my main point is I think religion has resources for dealing with these questions. Of course, religion does spend a lot of its time considering what it's like to have contact with an intelligence entirely unlike our own, that intelligence being known as God. So that might be one way of thinking things through. But this business about convergence in evolution does mean that if that's right, then that means that evolution is constrained. So that intelligence that arose through processes, evolutionary processes, natural selection and others, would be quite like ours, it seems. So that would be one implication of the constraint of evolution. And I also thought I would just add that just because I might have expectations in a Platonic kind of way that there'd be such a thing as moral consciousness throughout the universe, much as there's pie in the sky, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a happy story. I don't know if you've read Mary Doria Russell's book, The Sparrow, which to my mind is perhaps the best novel ever written about making contact, and it ends absolutely horribly. But we share mathematics, we share music, and we share moral issues with the aliens with whom it goes so horribly wrong. We need morality because things go wrong, basically, not because things go right. So it's not necessarily a happy story, my Platonism.
Thank you, Mark. Richard, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think the great question there was this issue about humanity's ability to define other things as not intelligent, and we seem to be keen still to do that. It always fascinates me that Darwin himself, in his famous trip, when he got to Tierra del Fuego, the natives there he thought were so inferior he had difficulty classifying them as human. And he himself was, in a sense, as guilty as any of us of that kind of speciesism. I'm actually optimistic. I think we've made progress since I think our attitude to black people, I think our attitude to people of other cultures, I'd like to think our attitude to some of the other species on this planet is progressive. I think both ethically we treat people of other races, other cultures as equals, at least in principle. I think there is a greater move towards looking at possibly other species, primates certainly, possibly dolphins, cetaceans, octopus, and so on. There are moves towards greater ethical understanding and treatment of other species. And also, of course, scientifically, and this leads us on to the next sessions, neuroscience is revealing an enormous amount about what it means to have intelligence, what intelligence is, what forms it takes. And I am therefore optimistic that whatever we discover out there, assuming we discover anything, and it's still an open question, assuming we discover any life out there, if we discover any intelligence out there, we will, as a species, as an intelligent species, now have a more rational and more ethical approach to what that intelligence is.
Thank you for your questions and comments. Can we thank our speakers?
Thank you.